So I'm really excited to be part of this conference, be part of this event today, because I think what we're doing is something really innovative and important, actually, and that's that we're bringing together, we're making an intersection between two issues that are not typically brought together in this country, and that is mass incarceration and its relationship to power, domination, and privilege in the United States, and mass incarceration and its relationship to power, domination, and privilege in Palestine, in particular in regards to Israel's occupation over Palestinians. And also we're bringing together the struggles against these forms of domination and privilege and the role that incarceration plays within them. And in this intersection, I think we're seeing a key shift in a lot of organizing and activism today, which is and among struggles for justice, which is that people are increasingly trying to find the common between various struggles, trying to find those points of intersection that link up various struggles, and building broader networks of solidarity and struggle to unite sort of our common energies to fight these, and also to find those points of commonality and intersection that we can build from and build new relationships of learning and understanding. When it comes to the issue of the United States and mass incarceration, and Israel and mass incarceration, there are a number of obvious points of commonality that we can think about. One obvious one is the fact that the United States gives Israel, a high-tech industrial country, about $4 billion a year, particularly funding its military and its military occupations, not only Palestinians but of other Arab lands. In addition, the United States provides diplomatic and political support to Israel that enables Israel to continue its occupation. While at the same time, that money could be going to fund other things in the United States, our school systems, our healthcare systems, other things that are essentially needed in our society today. And conversely, what Israel gives back to the United States, and this is detailed, let's say, in Naomi Klein's recent book, Shock Doctrine, right near the end, she talks about Israel's laboratory of repression, is it gives back to us a lot of techniques and technologies around policing and incarceration, most notably that are being used in our prison systems today. In fact, if you look at police departments around the country, one of the main places they go for advice, consultation, and exposure to new technologies is they go to Israel. And in addition, Israel plays a major role, its companies play a major role in building the border walls, the surveillance networks, the drone networks, and so on that are used to police the borders of this country. That's an obvious connection between these two cases that we're bringing together that we should talk about. But what I want to do, actually, is focus on another point of connection as a way of introduction to today's panel. And that is, I think, if we're looking for commonalities, one of the main things we see regarding the issue of mass incarceration is the role it plays as a strategy of social, political, economic, and racial privilege in both the United States and for Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. Power and domination works in many ways. Sometimes it works through brute compulsion, economic domination, immiseration, and poverty that keep people down. Sometimes it works through direct military power or sovereign power, direct policing and overt forms of oppression. And sometimes it works through incarceration, which is pulling people, putting them away, locking them up, putting them behind walls, putting them behind bars. And I think what we see in both these cases is a recent, in the last 3 or 4 decades, a recent turn towards using mass incarceration as a strategy of upholding the economic, political, and racial privileges of the dominant social system in both these cases. And that's just what I want to focus on with you here as the primary parallel. So, in terms of the facts about mass incarceration in the United States, I know many of you are familiar with them, but let's just go over a few. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world today. Iran, North Korea, etc., Russia, not as high as the United States. At this time today, there's more than 2.3 million Americans who are incarcerated. And the primary, I know this is hard to see, so, and I just want to give a shout out to Anthony Zaragoza. I borrowed some of these slides from him. He's a faculty here at Evergreen doing some amazing work on these issues. But today we have about 2.3 million Americans incarcerated. And the most striking feature about this incarceration, of course, is its racial dimension. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial and ethnic minorities. The U.S. imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. And more than 60% of the people in prison today are people of color. Black men in particular are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and 2.5 times more likely than Hispanic men. For black men in their 30s, 1 in every 10 is in prison or jail on any given day. And the numbers have been growing over the past several decades. The highest growing number in the demographics of prison population today is actually amongst women, their numbers are growing more than they have in the past. Most of those in prison, and this is an important part of the story, are in prison due to violations of our drug laws. And this is a very important theme that we see, the criminalization of drug use or of drug transactions and so on and so forth. But here's the story that I want to get at to make the parallel with the case in Palestine, which is that mass incarceration has not always been a form of power and control in the United States. It's only been since the 1970s, as you can see on the graph, that the number dramatically increased. And I think this is the key thing I just want you to focus on here in thinking about mass incarceration in the United States. Is that number, around 1970s. We also see the boom in prison populations as well, around the 1970s. And what explains that? Well, what explains that is what we've come to know as the quote-unquote war on drugs. And the war on drugs, or let me put it another way, what explains mass incarceration in the United States is not a rise in criminality in any conventional sense. It's a change in laws that produced criminality, that produced criminalization of not only certain behaviors, but of whole populations. And this is the key thing to keep in terms of the parallel with the Palestinian case that we'll talk about. And I just want to summarize kind of the broader argument of Michelle Alexander in a really important recent book. There's a number of other important recent books. But she explains this, and I think it's a very important framework for us to keep in mind, though it's certainly not the only one. She suggests that in the United States, and particularly when it comes to race, there have been several systems of power and domination that have upheld white privilege, in particular, economic and political as well. Obviously, slavery, to begin with, was a sovereign system of power and domination that upheld white privilege. And then, of course, after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, we had the rise of the Jim Crow, which is basically American apartheid, a system of unequal laws and powers and privileges that, in a sense, were a response to the openings that occurred after the Civil War with Reconstruction, in a way to maintain the system of power and privilege in this country. And what she argues is that the quote-unquote drug war and the mass incarceration that we've seen since the 1970s is basically the next round in the cycle. In other words, with the 1960s, the rise of the civil rights movement, the rise of black liberation movement, the rise of women's rights, gay rights, across the board, uprisings for freedom, self-determination, and an end to inequalities and privileges, that in particular for the African American population, what was the response to the openings? Mass incarceration. That it was a system to restore power and privilege, a strategy to restore power and privilege to the system. There's a lot more to her argument, but that's a key element I want you to keep in mind, and it forms a parallel I want to make with the Palestinian case. Now, some of you may or may not have background with the Israeli-Palestinian case, the issue of Israel's occupation. Maybe we're going to have more chance to talk, well, we are, because Karam's going to talk in a little bit, but I'm only going to just give you a little touch of background information just to understand the point I want to make. But first of all, I want to say that if you look at the relevant fact sheet, again, we have this information there, is that the Palestinian population, if you look worldwide, also has some claims to be made that mirror the United States. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Palestinian population actually has the highest rate of an overall population who has been incarcerated. So a different statistic. In other words, of the Palestinian population, 3.5 plus million living under Israeli military occupation, at least 20% of Palestinians at one time or another have been held in Israeli jails. And amongst Palestinian men, it's 40%. So a huge number of the Palestinian population has been in Israeli military prisons, has been interrogated, in many cases tortured, has been held and detained, has been separated from their families, has experienced incarceration. Amongst Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, it's hard to find a family that has not had at least one, if not two or more members who have been incarcerated by Israeli military authorities. This includes children under the age of 18, large numbers. Over 10,000 Palestinian children in the last decade alone have gone through Israeli military systems, as well as women and the elderly. Few Palestinians have not been touched by Israel's system of mass incarceration. But, and I want to make the parallel with the United States case, mass incarceration was not always a strategy that Israel used in its occupation. So it's important again to see the parallel. If you're familiar with the map, Israel, the occupied territories, we can go even closer. The West Bank and Gaza Strip is primarily what I want to talk about, although of course there's a broader history that one would need to talk about in terms of colonization and ethnic cleansing and previous rounds of incarceration and expulsion. But just to take the West Bank and Gaza, Israel militarily occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. And at the time, they imposed military and civilian occupation. The military occupation, much like the United States occupation in Iraq, Russian occupation in Chechnya, etc. Military occupation, military and civilian. The other thing they did was they built settlements. And Israeli civilians came to these occupied territories against violating international law and started to build settlements on Palestinian land. Land was confiscated, stolen, resources were stolen, water, etc. were taken to build these massive Israeli settlements, which now dominate the landscape of Palestinian land in the West Bank today. And in doing so, what Israel created was, much like in the United States, what I would call a Jim Crow occupation. In other words, a system of racial power and privilege in which the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants were under one set of laws, military occupation, while the Jewish Israeli citizens living on the same land lived under Israeli law, were able to vote for their governments, were able to have rights and privileges, and in fact were able to take the majority of the resources. Typically in these Israeli settlements, here's a beautiful bedroom community in the West Bank, towering over Palestinian population centers and cities and villages. Typically, Israeli settlements have 4, if not 5, 6, 7 to 1 in terms of resources, water, other things than the Palestinians below them. And it's backed up by the Israeli military. In a way, I think, strikingly similar to what we saw under Jim Crow. Palestinians do not have rights to contest this, to challenge this, and when they resist the occupation and the colonization of their land, they're often arrested. However, during the first 20 years of the occupation, outside of numerous practices that Palestinians, like just wearing the colors of the Palestinian flag, you would get arrested. If you organized politically, you'd get arrested. But in general, mass incarceration was not the method of Israeli control. It was rather what I would call disciplinary power. In other words, Palestinians were ruled through surveillance networks, collaborator networks, spies. They were forced to be day laborers inside Israel. There were numerous networks of controlled surveillance. But mass incarceration was not the form of domination. I mentioned sort of the Jim Crow, the apartheid-like system in the West Bank, Israeli settlers, power and privilege. Israeli settlers shoot and kill Palestinians, rarely ever tried, rarely ever convicted, and Israeli settlement expansion throughout the land. But here's where it changes. The occupation begins in 1967, forms of rule I was just talking about, and in 1987, you had the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, and this changed the game. At this time, Palestinians, finally fed up with the colonization, the relentless occupation, the settlement of the land, rose up and tried to shake off the occupation. That's what Intifada means, basically shaking off. And it was largely mass civil uprising, civil disobedience, and so on, creating liberated zones throughout the West Bank, forming parallel institutions, tax strikes, etc. Across the occupation. Palestinians made themselves ungovernable briefly. So what was the response? Much like what Michelle Alexander describes in the New Jim Crow, when we had in the 1960s, we had the rise of the civil rights movement, we had the rise of black liberation movements, we had the rise of other movements for their own liberation and an end to privilege and oppression. This was the Palestinian uprising, was in 87. In the United States case, what did we eventually get in response? We got what Michelle Alexander calls a new Jim Crow, mass incarceration. And that's what we got in the Palestinian case. Israel, instead of ending its illegal occupation, instead of enabling Palestinians to self-determination, which would have been acceptable under international law, pulling out all those settlements, pulling out its military forces, etc., what Israel did was try and reinstate this system of power and domination, particularly this racialized system of power and domination, through mass incarceration. Palestinians were detained. Let's say the numbers were roughly under about 1,000 a year. Palestinians were being incarcerated prior to 87. 87, 88, 89, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 are being incarcerated. You see the system, the way in which it attempted to restore the occupation and power. Israel built these mass prisons in the middle of the Negev desert and around. The conditions were horrible. And as I just talked about, Palestinians have experienced then a system of mass incarceration which continues to this day. So to sum up then, I think it's important for us to understand that there are different forms of power and domination that uphold systems of privilege and power. But every now and then we can see when the system gets cracked, we have responses. And I think that's what we're seeing here today, both in the United States, mass incarceration, instead of ending systems of particularly racialized power and domination, and in occupied Palestinian lands, instead of ending occupation and racialized systems of power and domination, we have mass incarceration. So that's a framework for us to think about of why we're bringing these two issues together. And as I said at the beginning, there are more than just those issues, but I think for our purposes, those are key. And the role of the United States in facilitating this process is very important for us, which is another reason why we're talking about this. That actually we have a say in both of these cases, both within the United States, obviously, but also in the Israeli case of mass incarceration of Palestinians, that we have roles, and I hope we spend the rest of this day learning more about the various issues and finding these points of common, these intersections between these issues, that we can work and end both of these systems of racialized power and domination and the use of mass incarceration to uphold them. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm very delighted to be at the Evergreen State College. Actually, when I first set foot in the United States, Olympia was the first place I actually lived in because my brother was a student here. And the first campus I've seen in the United States was the Evergreen. So I'm completely impressed by this place. I have been for so many years. That's the first thing. But also I have really very strong connections to this campus through the various faculty here. Therese Salipa in particular, and her wonderful family. I mean, Therese had known me since I was 8 years old. Well, now I'm 17, so it's not that long ago. Anyway, and also, of course, Steve Niva, who I've known for years as well. So I'm very honored to be invited to speak about this, even though it's not necessarily my particular area of research. But as a Palestinian who goes quite frequently to Palestine, 2 to 3 times a year, and I conduct public opinion surveys in Palestine, just finished one, addressing kind of the 20th year opinions of Palestinians after the 20 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords. A lot of different questions pop up, and I'm very delighted that the question of incarceration that not only happens in the context of Palestine, but also happens in the United States and has been for quite some time. I believe that this is going to be a big problem, and a problem in relation to a struggle. Okay, this is the new form of struggle that we will have to deal with for so many years in the 21st century, in my opinion. So it is a product of various types of kind of consolidated efforts and strategies of how to punish, in some ways, right? Punish those who are not particularly in compliance with specific type of policies or type of particular vision. But also, the carceral state is not really necessarily about the physical barriers that people are confined to a particular cell or a particular area or a particular city. But it's a large project, it seems. We cannot help but notice that there are a lot of patterns around which you do notice that a lot of those policies come together to punish a particular individual, groups, and of course a nation in the case of Palestine. If we're looking at comparisons, and I'm not going to be talking much about the comparisons here per se, but if we're looking at comparisons, we do understand the racialized element of this in the United States in a very scary way, okay? The racial struggles that exist in the United States continue to exist, and they will continue to exist for a long time. Race continues to be a very important indicator, even though Barack Obama is president. Okay, this is not going to change anything, all right? There's a bigger structure that has underlined basically much of the policies that exist in the United States. All you need to do is just really look at what is taking place in relation to surveillance in this country, how big data has been, I'm using my experience as a pollster. There's something called data mining, right? The NSA are the experts, okay? So, don't be surprised if all of your conversations are being recorded. Do not be surprised if all of your phone records are being recorded and utilized in some fashion. Now, this isn't necessarily that it will be translated into violence against you in some fashion, but you are part of the carceral state. You are. There's no way that you can think that you are outside of that particular structure. A structure that I would want to kind of argue that they're underlying much of what has happened from the 1970s on, as was mentioned in the context of the United States. Now, shifting back to the context of Palestine, there is prisons have always been used as a way of punishing people who don't necessarily fit within a particular political idea, of course, right? In the context of Palestine in the 20th century, the most significant kind of first big prison that was meant to punish Palestinians was the Sarafan prison, 1936, during the Arab revolts against the British and against the British and against more or less the Zionists who lived in Palestine, the Jews who were primarily immigrating into Palestine and creating a structure, or what we know as the Yeshuv structure of institutions that eventually led to the creation of Israel in a sense, right? The sophisticated institutions that were more or less tolerated and encouraged by the colonial powers, by the British colonial powers. So the British, in fact, started this big prison that anyone that deviated even 1 inch out of what they considered to be the good Palestinian, quote unquote, or the good Arab, all of a sudden they're into that prison. And people were in that prison for really indefinite periods of time. And that, in fact, is the origins of what we know now as administrative detentions. Okay, so that has existed since the days of the British. This is quite interesting to notice that the colonial powers are to blame in some ways, right? There's no way we can get the colonial powers out of the hook in this case, okay? So Sarafan prison is one of the earliest incidences where this happened. But I'm going to shift closer to much more, closer in terms of our collective memory. 1987, First Intifada. Back during the first Intifada, does anyone remember the ID colors? What was the color of the IDs of Palestinians in the West Bank? Does anyone know? Orange. It used to be orange in the West Bank, okay? Those who lived in East Jerusalem, they had an ID color of, anyone? Blue, okay? It continues to be blue to this day. The Gazans had a different color, and it was effectively a very cheap measure, right, to actually be able to decide who is to pass through a checkpoint and who is to be known as a Palestinian who is a resident of the West Bank and who is not a resident of the West Bank, okay? Why? Because effectively in 1993, all of a sudden, when the checkpoint policy emerged in September of 1993, then all of a sudden you had a very easy, efficient, quick, and almost free, basically, because you had soldiers who are mobilized from, free military and kind of mandatory service that Israelis have to deal with, right? Then to say, okay, those who have an orange ID, they do not pass through a checkpoint, period. They are not allowed in East Jerusalem, period. It was very effective, and it almost happened overnight. I actually remember it was a Friday. We went to Jerusalem. I grew up in the West Bank city of Hebron. My mom and I and a couple of my siblings, we went to Jerusalem, wanted to visit my aunt. We were stopped at the checkpoint that is between Beit Lahem and Jerusalem. And the soldier said, "You're not allowed if you have a West Bank ID." And our IDs were basically orange ones. The only way you could pass is if you had the blue ID, okay? And they actually turned us away. And my mom, for a second, said, "Wow, next thing you know, they will not allow us to enter Jerusalem." Ironically, that's exactly what happened, okay? So now Palestinians will have to have a particular special permit in order for them to enter Jerusalem. Regardless of whether or not you hold another ID or another citizenship, or even if you have the quote-unquote privileges of Western Europe and the United States of America's citizenship, you are still a Palestinian. And that's really how those types of policies discriminate. Similarly, if we are trying to compare them to the context of the United States, this is how, if you're black, you can't escape being black. Even if you don't necessarily want to, in the sense to be considered in that particular whatever it is, you want to define yourself in different other ways, you cannot escape it, okay? There's a system that is already placed for you, that all of a sudden you should be underprivileged in the sense, right? And it's really, that's where the problem lies, in my opinion. Similarly, when we're talking about the context of Palestinians, it's a little bit more black, unfortunately, because in terms of, it's funny how race in the United States is thought of oftentimes as a phenotype, but actually it isn't. It's a socially constructed form of social categorization. We all understand that. And we have to really understand that if we are looking at the context of how Palestine operates and the discrimination that takes place in relation to how Palestinians are treated by the Israelis and Israeli occupation in general, okay, or actually more specifically, then we would actually look at those policies of making it easy for someone who holds a particular color ID, a very easy, very inefficient, for the lack of a different form that is discriminatory, that is similar to that of race in the United States. So we've got issues that are global. The carceral state is not about necessarily just a prison. It is about checkpoints. And those checkpoints are not necessarily, and it has been proven time and time again by so many different social scientists and those who study the question of Palestine daily, okay? Those checkpoints are, more often than not, have nothing to do with security. More often than not, when you are stopped at a checkpoint, you're not asked for your ID, your IDs are not being checked, but rather to create a humiliating type of an experience. The carceral state is not about, again, non-physical barriers, but it's also the psychological anxieties that an entire nation has to deal with. If you're a Palestinian, you live in your home. And also, there are places in this country where people, minorities in particular, they don't feel safe in their own homes, okay? Similarly, Palestinians, when I was a child, I actually used to be afraid of sleeping in my own home, literally, okay? So to actually feel that there is always something out there, okay, that is going to get you, it's that form of structure, of power, that shapes punishment in ways that have been unprecedented. And it has to do primarily, in my opinion, with the advancement of various types of technological advancements. Okay, I mean, it's funny, that we use technology as opposed to the betterment of humankind. We actually use it to reinforce these types of policies that would unfortunately discriminate against a particular people. So IDs is one form, right? Checkpoints are another. They're very effective, very easy, very simple to cut an entire territory. And here I'm speaking specifically about the context of the West Bank. Palestinians, of course, in Gaza, they live in prison. I mean, this is quite clear. And those who actually, well, is it a prison, is it not? I mean, I don't know. If you consider a prison to be bars and a confined cell, then it's not. But if we are actually trying to think about the ramifications of having a place like Gaza existing on Earth, that equals, in my opinion, something as effective as a prison to control a particular population and confine them to a particular place. So Gaza is a prison, an open-air prison. One of the highest densely populated areas in the world, with very little access to the outside world. Gaza is effectively a prison, one. If we're thinking about the West Bank here, we have a very sophisticated network of checkpoints that really effectively have paralyzed movement of goods, services, and more importantly, people, okay? Coupled with, and that policy has existed for quite some time. I mean, checkpoints, not only the permanent ones, but rather the quote-unquote the flying checkpoints, mahsoum tayyar as they're called in Arabic, because it's like all of a sudden you turn around a road and then you have a military jeep that actually stops people. Stop, show me your ID, or don't stop, show me your ID, but wait for 15 minutes to remind you that there is some form of occupation, and then your humanity is basically less important than somebody else's in a sense. So the checkpoints effectively have paralyzed Palestinians on multiple levels. But if you add to that what is known as the separation wall, or the security fence, as some would call it, you effectively have created a system that has paralyzed the idea of social reproduction. Okay, you've actually allowed that community to be cut into multiple little fragments. And the idea of social reproduction, the stories that you've heard from your grandmother and grandfather, and the ways by which you live, and that really reinforce your identity as an individual, part of a group and part of a nation and a particular people. Okay, that is being challenged. Especially when we're talking about again, I'm going to bring back the physical here, the physical barrier between you and your lands that you used to work when you were a child. That now the wall makes it impossible for you to reach that particular land. So you've got different types of challenges that Palestinians are dealing with. The least of which is the physical barrier. The least of which is the idea of being in a confined cell. There are policies that really are systematic, that are structural policies that are systematic, that reinforce the subservient position of Palestinians in terms of power in relation to those to Israel in general and the occupation in particular. Ask every Palestinian about their experiences as they cross the Jordan River from Jordan. Most Palestinians who live outside of Palestine, as they leave from the West Bank, they would have to go actually through Jordan. So as they're coming back, like my case, I have to fly into Amman, Jordan, and cross the border. You will see how Israel deals with Palestinians who are arriving. Okay, there's that idea of trying to make you not come back. It happens quite frequently. And some people are nodding in the audience. I oftentimes, not all the time, but I get stopped and, hey, so what is your research about these days? I tell them a lot. I give them a lesson about how to do quantitative methodology. It's quite an interesting, quite an interesting exercise. And then I basically, tell them what I work on. But the interesting thing is that, I oftentimes get told, like, why do you come here? These people are not like you. And to me, it's a very difficult moment to be in, right? Whereby you are told that, look, you and your kind are not necessarily welcome here, because if you're here, you're going to be just like everyone else, okay? And you're going to be treated so terribly and so poorly. So you should go back to America, okay, where you have the freedoms and you're Harvard and you hold America education and whatnot. Just go there. To me, that really sums it up. Okay, it sums it up. It's really a war against people and ideas of who you are. Okay, and that's the very reason as to why we should care about this very important conference today. Not only because we're talking about a very important subject in relation to the carceral state in general, but also to speak about the importance of remembering people whose ideas will live on, like the ideas of that of Rachel Corrie. So thank you.
Hello, it's wonderful to get this invitation to speak with you here today. I think an invitation is one of the most wonderful things. Think about an invitation to dinner. What the sparkling conversation you're going to have, the food that you're going to have. And I just want to invite you to come on a journey with me. This journey will be a little bit about who I am, what I see as an attorney and as a public defender in the court system, about who has the power and the effects of that that I see, and then as an attorney, what are some of the bright spots that I see even in the system that we have. So we've been talking about mass incarceration, the parallels between here in the United States and Israel. So who here feels really comfortable? Let's say you got a dispute at your house. Who feels comfortable calling the police? All right, you feel comfortable calling the police?
Sure.
All right. Even knowing that we're talking about the system of mass incarceration, you feel comfortable?
Sure.
Okay, why do you feel comfortable?
I think I'll be safe, and I think that they coming to my house will make me safer.
All right. What about the consequences? Let's say this is another family member that this incident is going on with. What do you think are the consequences for that family member of that phone call?
They might get in trouble.
Okay.
I don't think I will, because I'm obviously following the law. So.
Okay. Absolutely. What would you most want to happen with that family member if they did get into some sort of trouble?
That they be treated fairly and justly.
All right. Fairly and just. And do you think that your family member is going to be treated fairly and justly in the court system?
I do not know.
Okay. All right. Yet you're comfortable calling the police, even though you don't know.
Well, when you originally posed this, I didn't know why I was calling the police.
Yeah.
And now that I know, if there was some issue of safety of me or anybody else in my residence, I still think I would call the police, because it's an issue of safety.
Okay. What about if it was involving drugs? Like your family member was having a drug problem? Would you still feel comfortable getting the legal system involved? I mean, do you think the legal system is going to listen to your concerns?
Yes, she said innocently.
All right. And so what that brings to mind to me is just anybody out in the crowd, who do you think has the power in the courtroom? And when I'm talking about the power in the courtroom, I'll just give three things you could choose. You could choose the prosecutor, you could choose the judge, or you could choose the defense attorney. Anybody? The prosecutor has a lot of resources. Somebody said judge. Okay, why do you think the judge has the power?
Well, I think it depends. Did you say district attorney or
You said that a judge has a lot of power. All right. What I want to talk to you about is a concept called probable cause. And I need a volunteer. I need a volunteer. Come here.
Sure.
All right. All right. So, all right. I'm going to grab him, and he's going to pull away. Just pull away. All right. I'm going to grab him, and he's going to pull away. So, now you have just seen me assault him. Okay? All right. But as a prosecutor, I could charge that as an assault in the 4th degree, or that's a misdemeanor. Or as a prosecutor, I could charge that as unlawful imprisonment. That is a Class C felony. All right? So you can have a seat. So what's the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony? All right? A misdemeanor doesn't stop you from, getting a job later on. It doesn't stop you from getting an apartment. It doesn't stop you from getting a job. But a felony conviction might stop you from getting a job, might stop you from getting a residence. And so as a prosecutor, what you do is you come into court and you ask for probable cause for assault in the 4th degree. The judge doesn't ask for that. They just get a document in front of them, all right, that says what the charge is. So as the prosecutor, I have a lot of discretion. Okay, so the person that has the power, in my humble opinion, is the prosecutor, all right? What they ask the judge to find, okay, in that situation, they've got a choice. Do I ask for a felony or do I ask for a misdemeanor? Now, you just saw what I did, all right? So it's my judgment as the prosecutor about what I'm asking for. Okay, the judge just reads the document, and if the judge asks for unlawful imprisonment in that situation, that's what a judge would have to find, and the penalty for that is higher. All right? So, think about things that are with mandatory minimum sentences. What I critically want you to realize is that I often deal with sex offenses, or I deal with drug delivery charges where the penalties are up here that the prosecutor can ask for, and the only thing the judge can decide is whether there's probable cause. All right? That is a very important concept. The only thing they can deal with it, once they find probable cause, if they find it up here, then you're going through court in a system, all right, where you're looking at this huge charge, but then they come up to you with my example and go, I know I got you charged with unlawful imprisonment. Why don't you just plead guilty to assault 4? All right? But the person might say, but I didn't do anything. Or I didn't do this high thing, but I didn't do this high thing. And so I want to contest that. And what you were saying was, hey, I think the court system is fair. Well, in my practice, for some reason, I have known since I was a small child that nothing was going to be fair. That I did. And I guess I can tell you that the day I became a lawyer, I was sworn in at the Supreme Court. And it was, you got at the state of Washington here in Olympia. It was a great day. And afterwards, I decided to go get a book. Well, I was accosted on the street and called the N-word by a group of hoodlums. So I'm surrounded by a group of hoodlums. And out of a door comes a person, hey, I'm thinking they're coming to help me. They asked me what I was doing to them. So because of the color of my skin, they assumed that I was attacking 5 other people. That's crazy. So, what I want you to realize is that our society has a lot of things that are unfair. through economics. And one example that I can show to you is through, I was recently in juvenile court, all right? And so in juvenile court, juveniles have a lot more options, all right, about things they're able to do. And so I would regularly represent people who were white and represent people who were black. And what I noticed is that the folks from the white families had more resources in order to do a simple thing like get out of jail. They had more people who were able to be with their kid for 24 hours a day. So because they could do that, it allowed the judge to let that person out. Okay? Yet the black person, they didn't have a family member who could watch them 24/7. All right? So what this meant was that if they committed a felony, just the same as as the white child, because they couldn't get out, they couldn't take advantage of a simple diversion program. A diversion program that would allow them to do community service, get treatment, and then come back before the court, write letters, get support from the community, and say, hey, I deserve a chance to get this removed from my record. But because they simply couldn't get out of jail, they didn't get that opportunity. All right? And so what that gets to me to another thing that I want to say is that the prosecutor in that situation, right? They're not feeling like they're a racist. Okay? The program was available. It's not the prosecutor's fault that the black person's family wasn't able to watch their child 24/7. That's not their fault. That is the beauty of mass incarceration. That is the beauty of mass incarceration. I'm not a racist. Okay, everybody in the, I cannot go into the courtroom and just call the prosecutor a racist because of that. It's how the whole system works. When Ms. McCaw spoke earlier, and he spoke about how the sovereign, that the United States and the Indian nations were sovereign, that they were on equal footing, and that we are forgetting that, through how we are treating them, all right? And that we think that in a courtroom, that things are supposed to be fair. How can they be fair if you can buy justice? If it depends on how much money you have? If it depends on someone who's able to hang out with you for 24 hours, that you have the resources to be able to do that? How is that fair? It can't possibly be fair, yet we think that it is. I think that court is, you get a court hearing, okay? Don't get me wrong, that is a beautiful thing that you get a chance to say what's on your mind. That's great, but realize where the power is. The power is with the prosecutor, not with the judge. A lot of people have a misconception that the judge can order stuff like, they think, well, if I call the police, why, they're going to get treatment. Go to a prison and see what kind of treatment that they're giving out. They're not giving out treatment. I don't have a program that I can say, hey, you sign up for this program, I know that you're going to get treatment, especially if your offense might be considered violent. It doesn't come automatically. If you're given a treatment option, the treatment option is something that you have to pay for. Take example of domestic violence. If that happens and the court orders you to get involved in treatment, the court doesn't pay for that. All right? Now, you may want to do it, but if you don't have the resources, how can that be fair? I think that we need to think of the consequences that we're imposing on people before we do it. Also think about the concept of bail. Bail means you gotta have money. If you don't have money, can't get out. If you can't get out, what do the studies show about if you can't get out? Is it more likely that you're gonna be found guilty or not? It's more likely you're gonna be found guilty if you're in jail. Why? Because you don't want to be there. Everybody is willing to plead guilty to credit for time served. What does that mean? That means you got a lot of people who are running around who are not guilty of any offense but pled guilty simply so they could get out. That's fair? Okay, so when I am acting as an attorney, my goal as an attorney is, I think, the oldest goal in the world. It's like Odysseus. Where did Odysseus want to go? He wanted to go home. All right? So my goal as an attorney, I'm not interested in, there is justice, right? But I'm interested in making sure that you can go home. Okay? I'm interested in making sure that you can make a choice about whether you get to choose whether, this might sound silly, I use it with juveniles, I use it with my clients, but whether you can eat bacon or not. Okay? Whether you have that simple choice. All right? Because the prosecutors determine the charge. The judge can't go, you know something? I can consider all of these effects that have happened in your life, where you grew up, your medical condition, how you've been as a member of the community. But I can't do that because this sentencing guideline, this grid, says I just have to add up how many priors you have versus the seriousness level of the offense. And because I found probable cause, there are 12 members of this jury who found you guilty of this. Now, it's great to have juries. I love having juries. That's a good thing. However, jurors have the same misconceptions as our society. So that if you're not in a law, a courtroom is just to determine facts. Okay, it's adversarial. It's people pushing up against one another. All right, it's people pushing up against one another to find a fact. It's really good at that. It's not good about consequences. It's not good about treatment. It's not good. It's not a good place for social engineering. Yet that's what we've foisted onto it. Okay, we forced it onto it that we wanted to. People come in and say, "Hey, I want him to do some prison time," and then after he gets out, we want him to reintegrate back into society. We want that. What I talked about in the beginning, that invitation, right? The invitation is to come back and be with us again. Yet, if you have mandatory sentences where people are doing life in prison, they don't get that invitation. Where do you get that invitation to come back? We've all done things that are wrong. I've done plenty of them. All right? I wasn't convicted of a crime. And I had to go through to make amends for what I did. But you want that invitation to come back. What we have to remember is that even though someone has gotten a consequence, we want them to come back. We want them to come back with us. And if you label them as other, they can't come back. And what this system of mass incarceration does is it labels you officially as the other. You are a felon. You are a sex offender. You are a domestic violence abuser. So even though you have atoned, even though that you have done your time, you remain separated and apart. And so when you are separated and apart, you have to have your own separate life that is not a part of the major community. And so when you're in those subsets, that's where the ugliness happens. when you get removed, when you can't come back. And so what I think that we need to do is create ways for people to come back. Now, there are some good things that are happening in the criminal justice system. I have been a part of juvenile drug court. People who were on these teenage crime waves that were unbelievable. And it is inspiring. So I'm about to wrap up, but it's inspiring when you get to see a government system, a judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, a treatment counselor, all coming together and clapping. This is the simple act of clapping for this young person when they come into court, and talking with them and saying, hey, how's your day going? And what are your future dreams? And to see that person change over 6 months. That is the type of thing that I think that we could use in every courtroom. It's not what lawyers want to do. We want to do jury trials and see who's the biggest, baddest attorney and who can sway people. That is false. What the court system should be about is about that invitation to come back. Thank you very much.